Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's roundtable on creativity. Boy, I'm excited to hear all of the things you guys have to say about this in our coaching roundtable, and with coaches and contributors here, some actual authors. And so it's very exciting to hear about all the ways that creativity works in the world. So welcome. And let's see, why don't we go around and introduce everyone? Then, of course, I have slides, but they're limited because I know we have a lot to say. So anyway, so Brian, let's start with you. Where are you at?
I'm in Vietnam, which is where I'm living now, and co-founder of A Life Design with You.
Great. Okay, good. You can
And
find you on the Alive
yeah,
Design website. Okay.
yep.
And Dean, where are you at?
I'm in the Lexington, Kentucky area.
Ooh, wonderful. Angela, for you?
I'm in the Austin, Texas area, specifically Lago Vista. Beautiful Lago Vista off of Lake Travis.
Beautiful lake view.
Wow. I have to walk down the street and look between some houses to see the lake.
Yeah, okay. And Jonathan, where are you today?
Hey, California. Today it's California.
Yeah, today, Northern California. And Zian, good morning. Where are you at?
On the precipice of Carlsbad and Encinitas. Technically Carlsbad, but I say Carlsbad, Encinitas, city borderline because it's really fucking close.
Okay, all right. Well, borderline, I think, describes you. So I think that's perfect for you to live there. A foot in two worlds, at least two worlds. So wonderful. Well, okay, let's get started on creativity. First, as usual, I take you through my amazing slides. So here we go. Okay, and I'm doing it wrong already. Hang on. No, I have to first get to the slides. Okay.
Technical stuff. I wouldn't even know how to go to the first one. So that makes you a genius by default.
Oh, there we go. Bouncing around. Yeah. So we'll hold off on the genius comments until I actually pull it off. Here we go. Okay. And share. Oops. Okay. We're sharing the right window. Now we hit present. And ta-da. Here we are. Creativity. Angela and I talked about inspiring creativity, enhancing creativity, discovering creativity, and we just straight up went with creativity. So, because there's so many different kinds. Okay, I have some quotes next to this fire. This first quote had Brian in mind. The mind is not a vessel to be filled, but a fire to be kindled. From Plutarch. Here's our next quote from a famous artist. I am always doing that which I cannot do in order that I may learn how to do it. We've just described my first year of a life designed right there. Pablo Picasso. Okay. And finally, we went with a scientist because creativity includes ideas that are scientific or design-oriented, engineering. The best way to have a good idea is to have lots of ideas. That's Linus Pauling. So, ways to think about creativity. Okay, I'll share in the show notes a lot of research about how you can find your own creativity, how you can get unstuck or unblocked or unlock your creativity. And I think if you know creative people, they might have tricks you can try. But creative people, which I think Angela, you and I would agree is everyone, different levels, different kinds of creativity, but not everybody sees themselves that way. But so-called creative people show tendencies of thought and action that are otherwise segregated in others, according to, and I'm not going to try to say researcher Mahaley's last name, very lovely, many letters last name. They balance intense energy with quiet rest, playfulness with discipline, fantasy with reality, and passion for their work with objectivity. So they move in and out of the different lanes with flexibility. Access to the salient brain network is key for creatives. And I didn't know what that was until I started this research, the salient brain network. So people that are creative with language engage in poetry, song, lyrics, journaling, for example, for problem solving. They find creative solutions to difficult problems. That's what Linus Pauling focused on. And he's one of two people that were sole winners of the Nobel Prize in two categories. The only other human that managed that was Marie Curie. And so Linus Pauling kind of knew what he was talking about. In physical art, what we think of as art, there's collage, there's using paint or colored pencils or fabric or paper, ceramics or woodwork. You know, we see so many, you know, people do designs with string. So, you know, physical art is a very broad field, kind of whatever you want to do. It feels like art to you. And then finally, music and dance. So sometimes people will dance around the kitchen while they're making their coffee in the morning in order to get the juices flowing for what they have to go write that day. So don't leave out movement, dance, music to enhance your creativity. It can take you into a no mind place where you're not thinking, you're just responding physically, joyfully, you know, with your expression. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is creativemornings.com. So those of you who watch this will be in the show notes. We have a chapter here in Austin, and this is where creatives meet once a month. It's available globally, so I think they're in 80 countries. And people who are in the creative arts or do creative work, that could be digital design, website design, any kind of creative work, including problem solvers like me, can go once a month to a meeting. Around the world, they have a single topic. And then there's reflection from a local person on that topic as it relates to creative work. And then you can watch videos of how they treated that topic in Sao Paulo and in New York and in Tokyo and in Sydney, all over the world. And so it's a place to face meet creative people and then kind of tap into a global creative community. It's free, creativemornings.com. Check that out. And then my memes. So the first one is Calvin and Hobbes. And the quote is, as my artist statement explains, my work is utterly incomprehensible and therefore full of deep significance. And you can see how silly and goofy they're being. So full of deep significance. And then in the middle, when people ask me, how did I get to be so creative? I tell them it's because I ate paste as a child. And I think that's as good a reason as any, you know. And then lastly, from Ursula K. Le Guin, a fantasy and science fiction writer who I loved reading growing up, really insightful person. She says, the creative adult is the child who survived. So
Yeah.
you can keep your child alive. Okay. I hope that primed the pump for us to talk about creativity. And Brian, I like to try to start with you. I know you have some notes. What are your thoughts on
Yeah, sure.
creativity?
Yeah, I like your memes and your slide there. So I'll bring up some different aspects which I think are cool to get into. Before the show, you mentioned AI, and I actually think you can sort of create a formula to make AI creative. And let me explain what I mean by this. You could teach AI to just associate tons of different things which are normally not associated with each other, and just create images or create short stories out of that. And that's sort of a way you could kind of create logic around creativity.
Mhm.
And I'm sure things like that will happen if they're not already being done. So there's that. I like the meme that you showed about like the children who survived.
Mhm.
Those are the ones that maintain creativity as adults. I have a point on that. I do think society, the education system, especially the workplace,
Keep going. I'm
tends
just
to
gonna step away
crush,
from you.
yeah, it tends to crush creativity, or at least it atrophies because you're kind of just functioning as like a gear in a machine. So that part of your brain tends to like atrophy. And I do think I think for many people that creates sort of a burden or like a weight on their soul. And I think that's part of the malaise of adulthood for many people
Mhm.
is actually that like atrophying or the crushing of creativity as they get older and everything just becomes about practical concerns. And what I think is cool, which I want to bring up, is sometimes I say I think people should be subjective inventors. And what I mean by that is see if you can create new states of being or new emotions or a new emotional cocktail where you feel different emotions at once, or like a new type of charm or a new type of wit or a new type of humor. I think it's good for people to create new words. Like I like jargon. I think it's cool when people do that. Like Shakespeare, invented words. I think just regular people should do that. So I like to see that kind of creativity. I also think it's interesting to try to describe creativity in different arenas. Like how would you describe creativity in photography versus how would you describe creativity in painting versus how would you describe creativity even in things like sports? There's people that create new moves or new plays or new strategies or ways to think about. So in these different arenas, like how do we describe creativity in different arenas? I think that's very interesting. And then also going along with just a life design premise here of designing our lives. I think the question, how much of our own lives can we create, is very interesting. Like, how many different areas of your own life can you influence and create the types of things that you want to see in those different areas? I think people should explore that question. And I also think it's really cool to like ask the question, how much is creativity like an important part of happiness? So I think looking at children is really important here, like looking at kids and the way kids are. If you see like kids playing with Barbies or like playing with G.I. Joes, they're basically extracting happiness just directly out of creativity, like just straight out of there. Like that's children like innately have that skill just by being creative. I mean, they'll find like a stick and a rock. Of course, today they're all on iPads, but back in the day, they'll find a stick and a rock and some mud and create a game out of it. Just straight out of creativity. That's all they need for happiness in those moments. So I think if you're in a childlike state, creativity can be like 100% of your happiness in certain moments if you allow yourself to really like embrace that. I think that's really, really, fascinating to look at. I also think like what practices, what techniques can people use to enhance their creativity if they're interested in that? I think it's good to ask that question, and I would bring that to the contributors here and see what they think about that, if they have any recommendations. And lastly, I'll just say I think it's cool to experiment with how much you can create the emotions you want to create. Sometimes I'll do an experiment where I plan an activity and then I attempt to plan my subjective experience of the activity. So I try to see if I can shape the way I'm going to subjectively experience something as I do it. So I don't know if that makes sense to people, but that's a certain way that I use my creativity. So yeah, and then I'll kick it over to next contributor who wants to jump in.
I'll say something if it about
Yeah, Dean, I was going to invite
Yeah.
you in next.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
I'll say something that Brian's remarks sparked in my mind. When we were talking about the school system diminishing people's creativity, etc. I mean, I do think that's 100% true. I think largely because the modern school system is based on an industrial model. But I also really wonder if part of what Brian called the malaise of adulthood isn't especially a modern phenomenon because of industrialism. And I just wonder if when we had an economy that allowed for more people to not necessarily be artists but craftsmen, and so that it was a economically viable possibility for you to become a potter or a blacksmith or a basket maker or any of these things that essentially are crafts but still employ a level of creativity and result in a kind of personal production the way an artist does. If the essentially destruction of the artisan and craftsman role in our economy hasn't really contributed to this malaise of adulthood. I mean, and I think maybe even the rise of something like Etsy is evidence that that's true. That as soon as people had an opportunity to maybe find a way to go back to being craftspeople, they did it.
Yes, I totally agree with you. I think that's a great point. And you bring up craftsmanship. That is a great expression of creativity. I mean, there's tons of people that can just spend hours and hours and hours doing that kind of stuff, whether it's woodwork, whether it's crochet, you know, like Etsy projects. I mean, and people get a lot of enjoyment and satisfaction out of that. Yeah.
I think it is. I think the notion of creativity is inseparable in some ways from the notion of meaning, and that what you're calling the malaise of adulthood is a sort of resignation to a way of living that is alienated from the sources of meaning, and that spending hours crocheting is in fact a source of meaning, and that and I hope we're in the middle of a cultural shift where people are trying to shift back to connection with those sources of meaning.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
So, Angela, I wanted to invite you in, particularly to mention journaling. A number of us have used journaling or recommended journaling with clients. And I know you've been successful with that and also deeply explored the artist's way.
Actually, I'd rather you speak about journaling because I started journaling and I was journaling since I was a little girl. And then I got to a point where journaling stopped serving me. And I think there could be a thing that can happen where you can overanalyze things.
Yes.
And journaling can keep you stuck in analysis and not take action or not tap into your intuition. But it is an important, I think, tool that's used in therapy. It's also used a lot in creativity and recovery of creativity. And I love that you brought up with your slide about the saying or the person that was using the meme about the child that survived.
Yeah.
And then Brian spoke about it too. And then you guys are talking about the malaise of being adults. But here's the thing. I think it's not just a child survived, because there are so many of us that have struggled and struggled. It's like the creativity or the child in us keeps popping up and then we stuff it down, and it pops up and then we stuff it down. So I like better, it's the child who survived or recovered, because I feel like that's what happened. That has happened with me. And it's like the story of my first several decades of life. So when I learned about how words were fun to rhyme and doing things with words, I kind of fell in love with words when I was a kid, and I would write little silly poems and I would share them with my mom and her friends, and they would get a little giggle that I was rhyming house with mouse and and I just enjoyed, the English class in school and all this sort of thing. But I had this perception, and I think a lot of us do, and I know this because I work in careers. I do job search coaching, resume writing, and helping people with, making that they're on the threshold of making a decision about their career step, and I help them there. So I've worked with a lot of people who have struggled with this sense of, I want to have more creativity in my work, or I want to be a creative person in my job, but I'm not allowed to, or society doesn't pay me enough to do it or whatever. So I've dealt with this quite a bit with my clients, but also personally, internally. Being a first generation college student, I decided to go to college because I enjoyed the learning process and I excelled as a student. So I decided to go to college, and I had this perception back in the 1980s, really dating myself now, that you had to go get a college degree to get a job, right? That was kind of the thing. And I didn't want to necessarily do what my parents had, who had vocational path. My dad was a welder and a pipe fitter and belonged to a union, and his jobs, he had no freedom because his jobs was like, here's the union job giving you a job, and that was the job you had. The union went on strike, you had to go on strike. He didn't have any freedom in his career, I didn't think. Though he was an artisan and he was a craftsman. My mom was a hairstylist. She was a hairdresser and an entrepreneur because she had her own beauty salon. So she expressed her creativity through cutting hair, because that's like a form of sculpture in a way, really. There's a science to it, and then there's a creativity to it. So these were my examples, and I didn't want to work in a beauty salon, and I didn't want to be a welder, and those were my I wanted to go to college. And so I think the idea that I had where I need to go get a business degree, and here I was excelling in English, and I was denying this side of myself. And this is, I think, a dilemma that many people have, right? Ultimately, after a couple of major changes, changing my major several times, and I finally decided I'm just going to study creative writing, poetry and short story writing. So that's what I got my degree in. And then I thought, and I'm going to the business world, and it won't matter what my degree is. And that is the case. The case is that except for a few professions, like I really want my engineer who's building a bridge to go get an engineering degree. I really want my brain surgeon to actually get a medical degree. I mean, I want them. Right?
Agreed.
But I'm sorry, to be a poet or to write resumes like I do and show my creativity that way, I don't have to go get a degree in resume writing, but the writing degree has served me. So fast forward to 2001, where I had taken a big hiatus off of writing poetry. And to speak to what you said, Dean, about schools, and the fact that they were designed for the industrial age and to really train workers for the factory. There is something to be said about going into creative studies and learning skills, right? So I learned about all sorts of poetry forms. I studied all the great poets, modern and ancient, etc. And it's supposed to teach you the skill, right? But when you're going into a class that is a more upperclassman class, there's graduate students in there, and you're bringing your poems, you're supposed to have a certain aptitude or, scholarly ability. And then you bring these poems, and in my case, I was bringing poetry, and you present them to these folks, and then they tear it to pieces, little heart to pieces. The thing is they're not discerning between, we're teaching you, we're giving you critique from a skill building perspective versus we're not going to squash it. We don't want to squash your creativity, but it felt like it squashed my creativity because it wasn't handled very well, right? And it was peer review, which they're not qualified as instructors to, squash my little heart and give me critique. It just said, that sounded good, or that sounded horrible, or you missed the point. And it was a lot of egos involved. Like, whether your poetry is good enough to be read in a tea house or a coffee house or at a poetry slam. So I shut it down. I didn't even write poems for probably a good 10, almost 15 years. And then a friend in 2001 told me about this book, The Artist's Way. And this is a creative recovery book. So one of the things that is, Myrna will attest to me, and you guys who know me really well, is I'm very spiritually oriented, okay? So the fact that in this book, Julia Cameron subtitled it, A Spiritual Path to Higher Creativity, really resonated to me. And a friend of mine, Regina, who recommended this book, she actually later, fast forward many years later, became a spiritual director in the church. So it's not a surprise that she was aware of this and then helped me, find it. But a few of the basic principles that she talks about in the beginning of the book, I just like, to me, really resonates. And the fact that people will tell me that they're not creative, like an accountant. I remember interviewing an accountant once, and we were talking about a resume, and she says, I'm not a creative person. Just because she picked a conventional career that doesn't typically have creativity doesn't mean she's not a creative person. She creates, okay? She creates her life, period, right? So this, just a couple of principles here that really resonate. There's 10 basic principles. I'm not going to read them all, just a few. But creativity is the natural order of life. Life is energy, pure creative energy. That's the first premise in her basic principles. Principle 5, she says, creativity is God's gift to us. Using our creativity is our gift back to God, however you define God, right? Source. And then the 6th one I love, which is the refusal, which is why this is such a great book and helped me recover, which is the refusal to be creative is self-will and is counter to our true nature.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, okay, I'm all over that. I've done this program she has, which is like a 12-step recovery program for creative, to recovering your creative inner self. I've done it a couple of times since 2001 when I discovered it. And it's amazing what back then little me was like, I don't want to do this exercise. I'm freaking out about this exercise, to fast forward, a couple of decades later doing it again with some friends, and how I was just like breezing through it because of how much I had put into practice. And to speak to the journaling, morning page is one of the things she recommends, where you sit down if you really want to. It's like a spiritual practice. You open up your notebook and you write just 3 pages, and it's just stream of consciousness, and you basically empty out the garbage so that you can tune in your receiver to what you want to like tune into, right? So for me, creativity is very like I've been in this kind of battle with it all my life because it's there and it's so strong. And I went into this, I ultimately graduated with a humanities degree, but I've been in business and I've been in this world, especially with helping, advising people in their careers and their job search and creating a job or creating a life worth living, which by the way is a great book. And designing a life worth living, basically. And myself, I have finally gotten to a place where I'm like throwing it out. I'm just like, whatever, allowing myself to be creative and writing poetry and doing visual art and crocheting, Brian. I've been crocheting too. I used to crochet when I was a little girl, and I did some sewing yesterday, which is something I did a lot when I was a kid. And I did some sewing because I'm making some Christmas gifts from my daughter. So I think you can express that creativity in, I know, Myrna, you like to talk about problem solving, right? But because we have opposable thumbs and we have a human brain, we solve problems. Everybody solves problems. Everyone is creative. So when you said you were going to do this topic, I was like, I'm showing up for this discussion. So I'm going to kick it over to others. I have a couple of quotes from, if you guys want to hear it, from a couple of composers that talk about the spiritual aspect. Let me change my cheaters because I need small print. So this one is from Puccini, and he was talking about Madame Butterfly, the opera, and he says, the music of this opera was dictated to me by God. I was merely instrumental in putting it on paper and communicating it to the public. That's pretty straightforward. And then this one is by Brahms. He said, straight away, the ideas flow in upon me directly from God. So this whole thing about it can be a spiritual practice and a spiritual attunement. I have learned that if I try to direct the outcome too much, I get in the way of the awesomeness it can be. But if I like get into this kind of space where I can switch gears to use skill, but also to use intuition, then maybe even potentially a work of art could come through. And even then, I have to get out of my way and say, who cares if it's a work of art? It's just the act of doing it that is so exhilarating and so blissful And so gets me closer to the divine, basically.
Mhm.
And that's what matters more than anything, is tapping into and using and playing with and being in the energy of it.
Mhm.
That is probably the best thing I could do, not only for myself and raising my own frequency on this planet, but also helping and rippling it out. Because if I'm joyful in creating, even if I never show my pictures, like the one I have back here, or my poems, point is I'm doing it and I'm happy, and other people are gonna get a taste of that happiness somehow,
Mhm. That's
So
wonderful.
now,
Yeah.
quiet. I was very
Absolutely.
inspired, as you can tell by this topic.
Okay, good. Well, thank you so much.
That's great.
Jonathan, I want to come to you. And I know, Jonathan, you've used some creativity to design the way you are in the world, developing your alchemical hypnosis and your understanding of how consciousness works in the world and how you interact with it. Do you have thoughts today about how you express your creativity in your life?
When the world first experienced the first industrial revolution, like 90% of humans got out of work. It was horrible.
Mm.
Now we are experiencing the next industrial revolution 2.0. We are living it. It's the AI.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
whoever is not going to develop their creative abilities
Mhm.
is going to be fucked.
Oh.
There's no question about it.
Mhm.
You can play with the idea. You may like it, not like it. Nobody cares. We
Mhm.
have two kinds of imagination, like creative and synthetic. So when you start playing with the creative one, you don't have to compete. All you have to do is create.
Mhm.
Now, how do you develop the creative imagination? That's a whole different universe.
Mhm.
But it's true. Everybody has it. It is possible.
Mhm.
And it's, I will say, it is a must do. Developing their creative side, it's a must have, because the machines are already there and they can do everything better.
Mhm.
Everything that is not creative or that has a soul to it, they
Mhm.
will do.
Mhm.
So, yeah. And when it comes to me personally, I have my own, let's say, my own style, because there's many hypnotherapists out there. Like,
Mhm.
there's tons and tons of them. Each one of them has their own style,
Mhm.
which is totally fine.
Mhm.
And that's actually the beauty of it,
Mhm.
because once you develop your creative side, you're not competing anymore, because nobody can compete with you. You're just creating.
Mhm.
In this scenario, it's my style.
Your unique
So,
expression.
eh,
Mhm.
yes, exactly. Correct. Because it's unique. Somebody might like it, somebody might hate it. The
Mhm.
reality is, I don't care.
Mhm. Well,
So, so if the ones that wants to work with me, they will be like, oh, this is unique. I can work with this. Someone else will be like, nah, I don't know, not this one.
mhm.
So, and the beauty of it is because what makes it beautiful is there's no competition, because, like I said, there's billions of humans out there, and there's a lot of other kind of like hypnotherapists out there.
Mhm.
So it's such a vast world that
Mhm.
there's no need for competition.
Mhm.
That is something that you have to like learn. And in my experience, um, to get to the point that you acknowledge that you don't have to compete, you have to actually unlearn a lot of stuff, a lot of bullshit that you have learned in the past. Because most humans they grow up thinking, oh, I have to compete, I have to be the best, I have to beat my neighbor, I
Mhm.
have something. That's I have lived through that. So then you have to unlearn. So you have to get rid of all this nonsense, and then you have to relearn the idea that you don't have to actually like, you're not competing, you're creating.
Mhm.
Now, everybody has that capacity, yes, but how many humans actually develop their creative abilities? That's a different question. Because to create, or to even some people think they create their lives. The point is that they create their lives unconsciously,
Mhm.
which I have done in the past. Most of my life, I learned the hard way. Actually, I was creating my life in an unconscious way, and everything was going wrong.
Mhm.
Uh,
Mhm.
then I had the fortune to learn that I was messing up my own like I was using my creative abilities in a very negative way. So I have to actually relearn how to create from scratch.
Mhm.
Um, so it is possible, and there's many different ways to develop that.
Mhm.
Hypnosis is one way, but I'm sure there is other humans out there that have different techniques. They can definitely help you with that. Also, um, this is my last point. Um, self-esteem. I'm not a huge believer of self-esteem, but if you don't have some sense of like confidence, clarity, and self-esteem,
Mhm.
everybody else is going to tell you something at some point. Oh,
Mhm.
your poetry sucks. Oh,
Mhm.
and you have to develop a thick skin when it comes to protecting your own creative side.
Mhm.
It's like
Mhm.
kind of like a bodyguard for your creative side. Um, so you have to develop. I would say is as important to develop your creative side. As important is to develop a sense of like respect for yourself
Yeah.
and like or self-esteem, whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
so that when someone comes and tells you, "Oh, the association of writers," tell you, you're like, "Shut the fuck up, you and your association of writers."
Mhm.
I do not care. This is the
Yeah.
best book ever. You
Mhm.
read it, fine. You don't read it,
Jonathan,
no
where were you when
problem.
I was 17 and I was going
Yeah.
nuts, man? It hurt.
Well,
Listened to
well,
it today and man,
you are lucky now I'm here.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate that. I like the idea that you have to guard your self-permission to create what's uniquely yours. And I think about like Picasso's blue period. We go through stages of development where we're more interested in this, and then that feels complete, and we're more interested in this. And if we step away from how other people judge our creative expression, we give ourselves permission to continue to be creative. And there is a sense of connection with the divine. If you are creating, humans are creators. Humans are creators, not just painters or chefs or, doesn't matter, engineer, doctor. The human organism has this creation component. So, Dean, you had some thoughts, and then we'll go to Zian.
Yeah, a couple of things based on what Jonathan said. First of all, the thing about competition.
Mhm.
I think when it comes to creative pursuits, what frees you from competition is that you move toward making things that are more and more authentic to you, so that they become more and more things that only you could make. And then there's no one to compete with, right? And so that connects with what Jonathan was saying about self-esteem or whatever we want to call that.
Mhm.
That the one thing that I do see holding a lot of people back from their creative potential is just their unwillingness to do a bad job.
To risk
You
it.
were you were reading some quotes earlier. Well, the writer G.K. Chesterton famously said, "Whatever is worth doing poorly." And and
Yeah.
most people are one of the things that holds a lot of people back from their creative possibilities is that they're unwilling to do something poorly.
Mhm.
And you can understand that in some way because we all have been exposed to so many great artistic works.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
there, and Angela's kind of bringing up, sometimes there is a lot of ego in these things, and a willingness and an ability to lay aside enough ego to accept that you are beginning an apprenticeship kind of journey in whatever creative endeavor you're
Mhm.
engaged in. I think that frees people up a lot to pursue things that they otherwise would not pursue.
It's a little bit like turning off your internal editor
Mm-hmm.
and just letting it flow, and then stepping away and coming back and look, rather than trying to make it great in the process of the making it.
Right.
You're in your own way when you're trying to do that. You have to let it come into life and then examine whether you like it or don't like it, change it, edit it. Brian, you had a thought, and then we'll go to Zian.
No, I was just doing the thumbs up.
Oh, thumbs up. Okay. Well, Zian, I'm thinking about you in at least 3 creative ways. So you write, so that's a creative endeavor. You have a background in music, and people know that song lyrics are poetry. You know, they move you emotionally. Song lyrics are poetry. And then you had this crazy idea about substituting lamb for beef on hamburgers. So I don't even know what you're about, dude. But you know, you're letting it fly in the kitchen too. So tell us what you think about creativity.
So let me touch on what Angela said first, about sharing intellect without ego. That's a huge problem in our society. That is a very rampant theme that has pervaded society, at our culture, at many levels. And when we when we share intellect or knowledge with ego, then we lack compassion, and what we say comes across as hateful, or it is hateful, and it's extremely critical and pathologizing, and it marginalizes us. It marginalizes aspects of ourselves, and we we internalize those critical voices from other people, and it starts to we absorb that energy. We literally absorb that those frequencies from other people, and they become a part of our genetic makeup, our molecular makeup, at the deepest level. Like it's a very visceral thing that happens to us when we're exposed to criticism, and that becomes a part of the way we relate to the world, and the way we relate to ourselves. So it's very key to learn how to share intellect and knowledge without ego, because when you do that, then you're not going to stifle the creativity of others, and you're going to also be able to relate to yourself in a range of ways that will engage creativity in very unorthodox ways, very, very non-standard ways. So for me, cooking is one thing that fuels my creative juices. I love getting in the kitchen and experimenting, adding new spices. I was raised in an environment where my parents taught me how to cook. I didn't see, the thing is, my dad and I were having this conversation the other day, like a few months ago. A lot of parents, I was saying how it's crazy how a lot of parents don't teach their children how to cook. And his response was that parents believe that by making things easier for their children, they're helping their children out, but by actually taking the easy route, they are making things harder for them in the future, in the long run. So I grew up in a household where we were taught to be self-sufficient from an early age. Me and both of my siblings, we knew how to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches when we were like 3 or 4 years old. And a lot of parents don't do that with their kids, and that's exactly how they unintentionally stifle creative energy in their children. They don't teach them how to take responsibility. They don't teach them how to cook and be self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency, I would argue, is a backbone, or one of the pieces that make the backbone of creativity. So I grew up going over. My grandma, she would have me and my brother come over for Thanksgiving, Christmas, like holidays, like Easter, and come over and bake all the food, the pumpkin pie, the stuffing, help with the turkey and all that. So I embody that creative energy to this day. I love getting in the kitchen, experimenting with different spices, flavors, textures, just all sorts of shit, things that you wouldn't think of that I figured out. Like I had to, okay, so I'll give you a quick example. I had to figure out how to, I wanted to make a peanut, no, not peanut butter, pepperoni Parmesan grilled cheese sandwich, but I had to figure out how to melt the Parmesan properly without burning it. And that took an extra step. Like I actually had to think about that for about a fucking week to figure out how to do it. So that's just one example. But moving on, like to acknowledge how creativity works in a wider degree of situations. For me, I'm a big fan of this this tenet. If your ability to be logical and objective is out of balance with your emotional world and how your depth of thinking and your depth of feeling and compassion, you are going to have a very difficult time being around people who will challenge you emotionally and intellectually. And you will find yourself in a world of psychosis. You will have a very mild to significant level of psychosis. Your emotions have to be grounded in logic. And if they're not, you're going to find yourself dealing with emotional repression on a very noticeable level, to the point where you will blame people and outside circumstances and situations for not conforming to the way you think, because you believe that your happiness is dependent on a false sense of safety in the way that people have to think and feel as you do in order for you to feel safe. So that's part of what helps me stay grounded and expand my level of creativity, by grounding my emotions in logic, keeping my depth of feeling and compassion and empathy grounded in objectivity. And if you're not doing that, you're going to have a very hard time in life. You're not going to play well with others who don't think like you and oppose your views and preconceptualized views of reality. So I combine like cold, analytical, objective analysis with like wildly intuitive creativity and imagination. So I'll like daydream. I will daydream about realistic or hyper realistic situations, and then I use intuitive logic on how to overcome obstacles in those situations. Like I'll daydream about what I do and don't like about situations with dating and women. So, and then I ask myself, okay, well, what do you not like about this situation? What is it that you have an ingrained belief about versus the reality of what's happening? And how do you discern between that? And what amount of fear and resistance are you putting into this that's meeting the amount of fear and resistance that you will make contact with in the woman? And how do you overcome that? And then that's where I engage the emotional side of that. And I say, well, what's real, what's not, what's coming from fear, and what's coming from a place of confidence, charm, and expansiveness and love and compassion. So and that's how I use my creativity. So where was I going? Oh, what helps with that personally, and I would say even in a more culturalized sense, is by taking an interest in unorthodox science, unorthodox views of science, and very unconventional views on knowledge and wisdom. Let me ground this in a more relatable stance. I've been listening to Esther Perel's podcasts for the last few weeks, almost every day. And I've been wanting to do that for the last year or so. I don't know if anybody knows who Esther Perel is, but I absolutely love her. Her wisdom and creative logic that she uses to help these people on her podcast is just so magical, and it's grounded in somatics and this very visceral, compassionate way of looking at the world and herself and people around her. So she made a point in one of her episodes of saying, what we insist on persists. So when we have a habit of reinforcing our identity in these, we have a habit of reinforcing these rigid identities within ourselves, in the form of saying, well, I'm not this kind of person. How Angela said, somebody may consistently tell themselves, I'm not a creative person. Or I'm not smart enough. I'm too stupid, or I'm too weak, or I'm not good at this or that. When what we insist on within ourselves in the confines of our identity persists. So when we constantly reinforce our position on who we are, we don't get outside of that rigid identity, and that rigid identity is anathema to creativity. Creativity demands that we step into a space of exploration. And that means being curious and looking at things with fresh eyes. So when we start looking at the full range of reality, by specifically in my case, engaging in looking at unorthodox bits of science and knowledge and wisdom, then we start to connect with different parts of ourselves that we never even knew about, that we weren't even aware of on the deepest level possible. And when we do that, then we start getting creative. Then we start tapping into those creative juices. And then we start being able to problem solve and expand our identity, and that sense of creativity that pours out onto the world around us. As Angela said, it raises our vibrational frequency, and that helps others, especially when we give verbal voice to those, that energy and that sense of intuitive logic within all of us, and it helps others.
Well, that's a lot. Zian, I appreciate that you took creativity to self-identity, to giving yourself permissions for a wider view, to noticing I put myself in between these two lanes. What if I moved the lanes out a little bit and decided maybe I could be a little bit creative this way? You know, I'm going to talk a little bit about journaling, and then let's do a round robin on our last thoughts. But when we identify these limiting beliefs, as you are speaking to, Zian, we find out what we've said no to. And we had very good reasons for probably saying no to those things. But then we never go back and double check, is no still the right answer about this thing? It's just installed as a no. I'm a not this and I'm a not that, and I don't revisit it. So when you come into a place in life where you're making a hard left turn or a hard right turn, you get a chance to revisit, why does this feel wrong? Oh, I don't have permission to do this. Why don't I have permission to try this? Because I think I'm this way. Maybe that's not true. So Byron Katie is famous for asking the question, is that true? Let's start with, is that true? Well, it has been true, but maybe it doesn't have to continue to be true. So I'll mention the morning pages as you talked about, and I'll share the link. There's this wonderful article that was written in The Guardian maybe 10 years ago now about someone who was tired of people telling him he should be writing morning pages. And he finally gave in. All right, I'll do it for a month, and then you guys can stop talking about it. And so after a month, he swore he would write them for the rest of his life because he said, I don't care what the pop psychology garbage is about this. I defrag my hard drive in the morning. I write the pages. I don't care what it says for 5 minutes, whatever's going on, but somehow I have more space. I am released. And it's now like not breathing or drinking water. I must do it because I get that reset, that reboot that just lets me think better, feel better, move through my day better. So morning pages, okay, I give in. They work for me. So So
And it's a great place for you to actually start to access your intuition. And if you then start accessing your intuition on a more consistent basis,
mhm,
then what you start to notice, and this is why I gave up morning pages, not because I have resistance to morning pages, but because I realized that my egoic intellect was wanting to talk more. And I don't want that to happen. I want more intuition to be more present in my life. And so therefore, what's coming out of the words, that's my ego. And I have been through some ego deaths. And so I don't want to necessarily resurrect it and give it its voice anymore. It doesn't need it. So it's not like I'm resistant to morning pages anymore. I just realized, hey, maybe this is a graduation. Maybe I graduated out of morning pages, but I did it for like 15 years.
Yeah, you're not collecting the daily trash that has to be removed first thing in the morning. You've stopped collecting it. You have rebuilt your engine or something. So, yeah, I think journaling can be so helpful also because we don't catch ourselves telling the story we're telling. We're living the story we tell ourselves. But again, it's hard to reflect. You don't have arm's length from your own brain, from your own heart. But if you write it on the page, now you have arm's length. You can go, what is this? Can you believe I wrote this right here? So I'm in my own way about that. It's a way to finally examine it more honestly instead of the feeling it while I'm thinking it, while I'm experiencing it. You can give yourself a little separation in the journaling. So sometimes it makes sense just to be doing that while you're processing a certain situation or a period of time in your life. The last thing I'll mention that is a really helpful visual thing, and I talked this over with Justin, who sort of gave art direction to a life design that he's busy designing his own life, is to go on a walking tour that's driven by color or by shape or by texture. So you walk a few blocks, whatever you're up for with your phone, and you only take a picture of the blue things, or you only take a picture of fuzzy things. And so you're again using that salient brain to just reduce to this particular thing. I'm only going to take pictures of things that have stripes. It could be somebody's dress or a sign or a poster. I'm going to notice all the stripes, and then all the stripes come into focus on your walk. And then you can go back and reflect on the phone. So what you seek, you find. And it can shift your image of the world you walk through. You're like, who knew there were so many stripes in this block? I never looked for them before. They were just invisible to me. But it can shift your awareness and your focus and help you snap back into the thing you now want to focus on, because you focused on something, as Monty Python would say, and now for something completely different. Just do something completely different. Okay, then we've turned the page and can go back to the thing we're working on. So I love that we all talked about the different ways we use creativity. The last thing is appreciation of the creativity of others. I sometimes tell the story about how I agreed with a friend to be an extra in an opera. I am the very last person that should be on an opera stage, and I found myself on one during Turandot, and I got dressed up in a kimono and a 4-foot wig. And I was an ancient Japanese courtesan, again, the literal opposite of who I show up in the world today. And I walked around in a kimono and a 4-foot wig and sat on stage while a soprano sang Turandot. And the appreciation that you have for the creativity and the beauty that's provided in the world by others enhances your own. And so dipping in and out of different genres of music, different genres of literature or poetry can spark ideas for you, and you can appreciate what God brought into the world through other people while you have things coming in through you. And notice, as Jonathan has said, all the varieties of the way those expressions happen, uniquely beautiful, each individual one. So, okay, Dean, your final thoughts, and then how people get a hold of you, and we'll do the round robin.
I think we've kind of danced around it, but I think I want to say that the practice of any kind of creative practice is ultimately learning how to, in a way, control your consciousness. and move from maybe what Angela was calling this ego, the part of you that functions consciously to make sure you get all your bills paid, to the more receptive part that is able to receive in a way what will become the basis of your work. And I think the great advantage of discipline is that if you do that long enough, you begin to be able to shift those modes at will. And so it's important to do it poorly long enough to get your ability to shift down.
How do people find
Yes.
you, Dean?
Oh, just go to deanabbott.com. That's the easiest way.
Brian, do you have some final thoughts? And how do people
Yeah,
find you?
sure. I think people made some fantastic points. Like, I think everyone made some really great points in this discussion. Yeah, so like Mom, you mentioned Byron Katie. So one thing that came to mind is one question you can ask is like, one of her kind of famous questions is like, who would I be without this story of these thoughts I'm telling myself? And I think that touches on the issue of removing blocks to creativity. If you have stories you're telling yourself or thoughts you're telling yourself that block the outlet of your creative expression, and I personally think any type of creativity that you are capable of appreciating on a high level, like you really see how great this is, to me that indicates you're also capable of producing things that are of that same level. Because if you can appreciate that level, you will be able to produce on that level also, because that means you get it, you sense it, you feel it, like you're connecting with that. So yeah, and I think what Zian said really helped me too, like with I don't remember exactly how you worded it, but I think that idea of allowing your creativity to go beyond your identity, or to go beyond sort of a, I don't know, a limited self-concept, or just your identity. I think that that clicked something in me where I realized that's something I need to do or explore. So, but I think everyone made amazing points, like
I
for
bet we
real.
find you
So,
on the Alive Design website, huh?
yes, absolutely.
Good. Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Angela, I know one of your jobs is to bring the whole person to what they do in their work. And you certainly have modeled that in your career. How do people get a hold of you if they want to bring their whole selves to what they do?
Well, I do a lot of critiquing of resumes. So it's interesting. Zian, thanks for picking up that thread and running with it a little bit more on how to deliver criticism. I just learned very early on, having been critiqued, how painful it can be when you pour yourself into something. Now, these days, people are coming to me with AI created resumes, and it's still not quite right because it's not got them in it. It's just a bunch of skills they put into the system, and then the system spits out something nicely worded, but it still doesn't have the authentic them in it. And so that's what I enjoy doing. And I think you can do this in a very gentle way, and you can do this in a very, I think, adding value. I think when you're giving someone feedback or you're helping them with expanding their creativity or expressing themselves in some way, whether it's through a resume or some sort of piece of music or piece of art or through a recipe that you're tasting that they've tried on you or whatever. The point is that you can do this in a very, when you take the ego out of it and you really be there for them and you're present for what can help them. I am here in service to them. I think that's when it really can, you serve creativity. So even though I don't do this directly, I don't teach how to write poetry classes, or I mean, I'm not coaching people on their creativity, like say Wendy Colonna, who's one of our contributors,
Yes, our creative coach.
where
Yes.
that's what she does, is coaches people on their, on their creativity. But me, I'm dealing with people in a very pragmatic, practical career thing. And so usually
Mhm.
calls for being very pragmatic and practical, but I still think we can honor the creative beings that we are. Dean brought this up about meaning. We want meaning, and this is what people want in their jobs, in any way they express themselves. They want it to be a meaningful experience and have more meaning. And to anybody who ever wants to, an accountant, anyone who wants to sit there and say to me, I'm not a creative person, I'm like, no, you are. I think we've all proven that today. And one more quote, and that's Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love. And she also wrote a book called Big Magic. And in Big Magic, she made the case about creativity. And she said, if you're alive, you're a creative person. You're creating. We're creative
of humans.
Hello. So that's what I want to say. And this was an amazing discussion.
Do they find you on LinkedIn best, or on your website? What's the best way?
Whatever. Yeah, it's fine. InSyncResources.com is my main website. You can find me under AngelaLoeb.com, and that'll get you to my website. And yes, LinkedIn. I'm also on.
Those links are on our about page too to Life Design. So, okay, Jonathan, I think of you when I'm working with someone and I refer them to because they have to do something outside the box. It's like, okay, now for something completely different, you need some sessions with Jonathan. And so
outside of the box can be scary.
yes, but not scary with you. So tell us a little bit about how people find you and any last thoughts you have about creativity.
I think everything comes down to whatever each one of us mentioned. It comes down to we all have the capacity to be creative. In fact, we are all creating at all times. It's just a matter of let's make it a conscious process. And then it's So you can find me in alivedesign.org, of course. Also Instagram, JonathanrCoaching, TikTok, same, and by email, JonathanrCoaching@gmail.com.
I'm talking and I'm muted. Okay, thank you so much, Jonathan. And Zian, is your neck right? Can you tell us how people find you? Do you have any last thoughts for us today?
Don't make fun of me.
I wasn't being critical. I was being playful.
It hurt anyways. It stung. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. No, your joke was well received. Yeah, no. Maybe one last thought. Yeah, we're all creative. If you limit yourself by, as I said, constantly reinforcing this rigid identity of who you've been brought up to be, who you believe you are as you've been brought up in the world, that's anti-curious. That's anti-exploration. That is anathema to all the creative intellect that lives inside every fucking cell of your body at the most somatic, visceral level. And that's all I have to say. People can find me at the Life Design website. You can also reach me at HeavenlyWisdom.Coaching @gmail.com. My handles on social media, except for Facebook, are Heavenly Wisdom _coaching. Facebook is just Heavenly Wisdom Coaching. So that's where you can reach me.
Oh, very good. Well, this has been an amazing discussion. Thanks so much for all these perspectives on creativity. And I know in our coaching practices, in the ways that we contribute to the world, we marvel at what the humans we work with are capable of, what they're doing in their lives, and how we can make adjustments for them to unleash new parts of themselves. So they're designing the life that they want. So thanks everybody for participating, and we'll see you all next time.